Thank you all so much to our panelists. Those were such wonderful and generative talks. We have some time for y'all to be in conversation with one another before we open up to audience questions. I want to invite you to ask questions of one another. I also have lots of things I'm so excited to ask you, and I'm happy to start with a question if you want some time to think. So one place to start that I was super interested in each of your talks was thinking, so we've been thinking implicitly about transpedagogy as equating to the classroom. And each of you are asking us to think, Francisco, explicitly in your talk, thinking about sites of pedagogy beyond the classroom, but Perry, in your talk, thinking about the scene you end with the student event of students reading poems. And Jay, the way that you're asking us to think about gallery spaces, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about where you see a trans pedagogy taking your work beyond the classroom, whether that's taking students in a formal pedagogical context out of the classroom, or whether that's, Francisco, in the way that you're asking us, applying a trans pedagogy methodologically, and Perry, you're giving us some of this language also to pedagogical contexts beyond a formal classroom space.
I can start. I just didn't want to go because I felt like was talking a lot. But I mean, for me, I am interested in sites outside of the classroom. Being someone who teaches at a HSI, right, where we have first generation students who, I think one of the marked differences that I've noticed in terms of hearing how folks talk about their students and what they're able to accomplish in a classroom, like at a HSI, I have students who are working 3 jobs, right? So realistically, I'm literally telling them what paragraphs and reading to focus on, right? So that's a more heavy-handed approach, but taking pedagogy outside of the classroom and kind of showing spaces in which they can see the theories that I'm proposing to them, or how I'm asking them to think about things differently, such as teaching a fashion class right now, right? So like to have them think about the clothes that they wear almost all the time also requires me to take them to places in which they might be able to see a garment created, right? Like, I don't know how to sew. I'd love to teach them how to sew, but I don't know how. My family they're all seamstress, so I should. But I just don't have, anyway, that's a longer story. But taking them to see like weavers up in New Mexico, right, into the traditions of Chimayo, and to see where and how Ralph Lauren and all of these other kind of brands get their imaginary of like the West, right? I can realize that because I live in New Mexico, and I can also have them think about kind of the gendered relations that are being enacted in the creation of a garment, right? So it's like extending the classroom in that way, but also knowing that with students that work 4 jobs, not everyone can go. So it's also about creating the kind of economic possibilities for them to be able to undertake that as well, right? To say, I'm gonna ask for time off from my job because I need to do this, right? And that also means being creative about institutional resources to incentivize that in a particular way. That's just a short kind of example.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that I was wanting to do in my remarks was to also push not just beyond not just to learning environments in general, but to think where's learning happening, and it's happening not just in our classrooms, but in our conferences, for example, or in our articles and our books that our colleagues are reading. Right, those are learning spaces. The whole idea is that people learn something through and in those spaces. So I do want to think. I think that we can't just think about. I think when we're thinking about trans pedagogies, we have to think about knowledge production structures in general and where they are and how they too need to be transformed in conversation. So just expanding a sense of learning environments. But then I also want to pause and say what we assume learning is constrains what we understand to be learning environments. And I think the challenge, especially from transcript and disability and mad studies, is to say how we've conceptualized learning in a traditional sense um, is sanist in many ways and is ableist in many ways, and is makes cis sense, one could say, in a lot of instances, but needs to be radically disrupted. What we think of as learning itself needs to be radically disrupted. And then that's going to also disrupt what we think learning environments actually are.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I'm thinking so much about what both of you, how you both responded. I think I've been really influenced and really a kind of lifelong student of abolitionist pedagogy. And for the past, I guess, 2 years, my sibling Tourmaline has been finishing a kind of creative nonfiction book on Marsha P. Johnson, and I've been assisting her with a lot of archival research, which has been kind of an amazing project. It's a forthcoming book. It'll be out from Random House sometime in 2024, but we've been able to kind of unearth new archival material around Marsha. And it has meant kind of sitting with the 70s and the late 60s and these kind of spaces of Black trans study. And study in the sense that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have the resonances of that. They define it, I think, in the under comments as what you do with other people. Just think about Perry's comment about what learning is. And so I think activist spaces, trans activist spaces have been really central to my understanding of pedagogy. Abolitionist spaces have been central to my understanding of pedagogy. And I just was Googling actually when Perry, when you were doing kind of the grammatical, etymological, I looked up pedagogy and I didn't realize that like the ancient Greek kind of origin story around it is about like the figure of the slave who would bring the child to as a part of like as the kind of servant of pedagogy, pedagogical. So the slave, the figure of the slave is wrapped up with the kind of etymology and historicity of that word itself, which speaks to the really the importance and significance of the ways in which that kind of pedagogical historicity is undermined in our actions and everything we're talking about today, really. And I think the last thing I would say is just thinking about activist trans pedagogy. There's, you know, so much of a political genealogy around that and so many groups, both formal and informal, that could be mentioned. But I went to, during the pandemic, a massive protest in front of the Brooklyn Museum. And I think there were like over 20,000 people. And it was the biggest protest I had ever been at in general, and of course, in particular around trans insurgency, sociality, life. And it made me, you know, I think that as a side of pedagogy was really powerful. And it also made me wonder like how to sustain that kind of energy, you know, when there's not the call for the specific protest. And so maybe a question I have is about like pedagogy and historical continuity. Yeah, so, and then I also have some other thoughts. Sorry to take up a lot of virtual time or whatever, about the anagrammatical, which is, you know, the work of Christina Sharp in The Wake. She talks about anagrammatical Blackness. And I think, Perry, when you were talking about trans and kind of political grammar, it made me wonder about like what are the theoretical resources that might be in that work for a project like that. So thanks.
So much. We have about 5 minutes, Maria. And so if y'all have questions for one another, if there are audience questions, this would be a great time for them. And then at 2:30, we're going to pause and take a coffee break before we reconvene at 3. But we still have a few minutes to take some questions if we want to open it up to the audience, stuff that folks want to ask our panelists.
Thanks so much for this panel and for the conversation that's been happening all day. I want to maybe say that across each of the papers, whether and sometimes language in terms of thinking about crip, abolition, decolonial, I was drawn to something that seemed like um, the role of refusal in transpedagogy, and I'm curious to hear you all reflect on um, whether or not and how refusal is constitutive to how you were approaching the question and how you approach the classroom.
I want to jump in and say it reminds me of one of your first slides was the refusal of identity and inclusion and objectivhood. So refusal from the
I'm gonna jump in, Chess, so I don't want to interrupt you. So, um, yeah, I think that refusal is a big part of the project. It's a refusal to, for me, it's refusal really kind of makes its way in kind of not creating a syllabus or like a narrative that I imagine is going to make sense in the ways in which the students are coming in by thinking about like the title of the class or so to speak, right? And then there's also kind of the refusal to use the traditional frames in terms of like assignment goals and things like that, or like rubrics. So I really have fundamentally changed the way that I grade my students. I use a scale in terms of like, you know, five. Like five means that you did well in the class and they're graded not necessarily assignment by assignment, but like as a whole. And it's very much tied to everyone's different capacities as a student. So I refuse to imagine all of my students coming in with the same capacity to learn and to take in information and to demonstrate that. And I don't think is that's necessarily inherently a trans pedagogical thing, but I definitely know that teaching loads and loads of trans students over time, I have been re-educated by them to they've been the most vocal in terms of pushing me to abandon whatever I imagined in terms of what they're going to get out of both the content and then also how they're going to manifest that in the form of an assignment, right? So to make sense of the concepts. So refusal for me has been refusing the norms of what we value in terms of being able to grade a student.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. I think that the kind of practices of refusal run through definitely like the work of Tourmaline around this kind of like fugitivity, refusal of the kind of the visual violence of the archive, of normative conditions of transvisibility. Um, yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about like the aesthetics of that refusal and those practices. So I want to think about that more, but I really appreciate that question.
maybe just to add one more thing about refusal and its relationship to refuse, waste, um, in which is I think shared across all of these kind of um, disciplinary and social histories we're talking about. But in the classroom, it now makes me think about failure. Right, that a lot of times we look back at our moments of having failed in a classroom as a waste of everyone's time. But what would it mean to invite wasting time into the classroom? I think that's a different orientation.
Probably a great place to pause. Please join me in thanking our panelists for the wonderful presentations.